actually delivered what we were tasked to do is not one, but multiple people had to step up and lead something, whether it was communication between teams, because not everybody could travel, whether it was designing the solution, whether it was assembly or logistics. We needed multiple leaders to step up, and we were not assigned any roles. So it was just up to us to identify the need and see who was the best person to step up and lead that component. The second thing that I learned is if you really care about the success of a group you're in, stepping up when you see a lack of leadership or a lack in general is almost a duty if you really care. The third thing is what I learned from the winning team, because we as a group debriefed their strategy to see like how did they win, what was so special about them. And the reason why they won is because they got on the same page the quickest. And they figured out that they needed multiple people to initiate problem solving, align everyone, and drive the results home. And all of these are leadership behaviors that we will discuss more at length in the second half of this talk. But let me introduce myself a little more. Why am I talking about this pipe installations in Santa Cruz Mountains? I'm Irina Stanescu, the founder of the Caring Techie Leadership Coaching, and I help software engineers and engineering leaders thrive in high-pressure tech careers by, drumroll, you guessed it, or not, building their leadership skills. I also write the Caring Techie newsletter that is read by over 30,000 people, and I got recognized as a LinkedIn top voice where I post quite frequently. And I teach a course. We'll talk more about it later. Prior to my role as a coach, I was, just like many of you, I assume, an engineer. For the last 14 years, I've worked for a range of companies from big to mid-size to extra small, such as Google, Uber, Ixia, and Mnemonic. My career progressed from junior engineer all the way to senior, tech lead manager, staff engineer, engineering manager, and lastly, coach. And I've been fortunate enough to see both good and bad leadership in action. And you heard that right. I'm grateful for seeing bad leadership in action because it made me appreciate good leadership even more. I picked today's topic for several reasons. First of all, because I believe leadership skills, especially shown by individual contributors like you guys, are the secret ingredient of high-performing teams. Second, I am grateful to have been exposed to this leadership training early on, but I understand not everybody has this opportunity. I firmly believe that that training enabled my career to progress the way it did, to tech lead, staff engineer, and engineering manager. Lastly, is because I believe the beauty of leadership is that it's applicable to all areas of life, not just work. It can help us be better humans in our families and our communities. And I wish this for all of us, to work in high-performing teams, to advance your careers, and to have a thriving life inside and outside of work. Oopsie. So, today's agenda has 3 parts. First, we're going to understand leadership, and we are going to discuss the myths and the realities of leadership. Second, we're going to talk about why it is important for individual contributors to embrace leadership. What are the benefits? How does it help you and the company you work for? And then lastly, we're going to discuss the 6 core categories of skills that you need to be a good leader as an individual contributor. And lastly, we'll save time at the end for questions, so I hope you scanned the QR code. So, why is leadership such a tricky topic? It's because when I ask people what a leader means for them, they say something around the lines of they're the managers, the directors, the VPs, SVPs, C-suite, people with formal leadership titles. They're the people we look to for answers. They're in charge, they drive the direction, and they usually make the decisions. It's no surprise that when I say individual contributor leadership, it seems a concept a bit vague and corporate-y, if you want, because the title isn't there. And interestingly, in my career, I've met and I've worked with folks that were clearly exhibiting leadership behaviors who felt inadequate to call themselves leaders because they were missing this title, right? So to really understand leadership, let's talk about what leadership is not. Well, first of all, occupying a leadership position is not the same as leading. And as you saw from my Santa Cruz experience, leadership isn't about titles. We were not given any titles, right? People needed to show leadership, not to claim the leader title, right? That didn't mean anything. And sure, people would form a leadership role. People like this in your career, you've encountered them, that have a leadership role, but they're poor leaders. And if you look around, we can see it from everywhere from CEOs to presidents, right? The reality is you don't need a title to show leadership because leadership is a set of behaviors. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. The second thing that I want to talk about is leadership doesn't require charisma or extroversion. And sure, charisma can help, but at the end of the day, charisma is about words, is about being likable and how you communicate to inspire others. But none of this means anything if you can't back up these words with action and walk the walk. Leadership is about caring of things beyond yourself. So charisma and extroversion are a little orthogonal. Helpful, indeed. Lastly, and this is a big one, leadership is not management. They might overlap, but they're not synonymous. Managers manage resources. Leaders drive impact with others. So if this was a talk about management, we would talk about performance management, organizational design, hiring, firing, project management, and more. Maybe leadership would be a module in the management talk. But we're not talking about this today. And yes, the best managers are also good leaders. But as discussed in the first point, leadership is not about the role. So you don't need to be a manager to be a leader. In fact, with my coaching clients, if they come to me and express interest in leading, but they show some sort of aversion toward the managerial duties, I advise them to orient themselves towards roles where they can show leadership, but not be a manager. Because if you become a manager and you're not willing to do, or don't enjoy really, to do the managerial specific things, you're setting yourself and others, your team, up for failure. So, and you'll see that the skills we talk about today, if you look at them from the perspective of a tech lead versus a manager versus a staff engineer, they're all the same and it's applicable, right? So, clicker is slow. Oh, so what is leadership? I turn to experts to define leadership. First definition that I want to talk about is from Forbes. It says, leadership is a process of social influence that maximizes the efforts of others towards the achievement of a goal. I think this is a great definition because it emphasizes a few key things about leadership. The importance of the collective, it says efforts of others in driving results. How leadership is tightly connected to social influence, which means it's not about authority, it's about influence. And it orients everything towards achievement of a goal, which, again, static leadership isn't like leadership if you don't focus on something that you want to drive home. The second definition comes from the infamous consulting firm McKinsey, who they have a good leadership definition. Just hear me out. That says leadership is a set of behaviors used to help people align their collective direction to execute strategic plans and continually renew an organization. What I love about this definition is that it also mentions alignment around the collective direction. But what's new in this definition is that it says leadership is a set of behaviors, which I also mentioned, right? And the third definition, and my favorite, comes from John C. Maxwell, a leadership expert and best-selling author, he says a leader goes the way, knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. And what this means is to know the way means to see a problem and have a vision for how that might be solved or how the future will look like if you solve that problem. It doesn't mean, in my opinion, the way I interpret this, that the leader has all the answers. That's not the point of a leader. The point is to engage everybody to figure out the answer, right? The second thing, they go the way, means they actually also adopt the behaviors and do the work to solve the problem. And then lastly, showing the way means bringing people with them along this journey, not just simply pointing out what should be done. And I'm sure we've seen people who are just like, no, we should do this and this, but then they don't get involved. So you can't be a leader if you're a lone wolf. All right, so now that we define leadership, let's go a level deeper and talk about individual contributor leadership. So the first question we need to tackle, why is this an important thing for individual contributors? Why should they embrace a leadership mindset? So here we're going to discuss 3 reasons that cover both the benefits for the engineer plus their companies, right? So reason number 1, traditional role-dependent leadership is outdated. So what I mean by role-dependent leadership is this assumes that only people with titles can drive decisions, drive solutions, make decisions, and everybody else just needs to do what they're told. And if you don't do what you're told, then you're overstepping, and you might suffer the consequences of disobeying. This model of command and control leadership doesn't work for the tech industry. It might work for other traditional businesses, but not for tech. And I'll explain why. And yes, I know that there are still tech companies where this is very much alive. And I even have clients who have been reprimanded for asking questions or taking initiatives. Yes, I know. And it's sad, and it's just such a loss for those companies. But what I mean by role-dependent leadership is outdated is also that it's a centralized model where that puts a lot of pressure on leaders. And leaders are only humans, and they don't always have the answers, and they're not always right. And the reason why I said this doesn't work for tech is because tech moves extremely fast and deals with a lot of uncertainty. When building software products, we're always learning about the users. We're always making hypotheses that we want to test out and validate. What was true yesterday might not be true tomorrow. Technology that was state-of-the-art yesterday might not be state-of-the-art tomorrow. And we don't have time to be running every decision up and down the chain. So what we want is for solutions and direction that can come from all directions. And we want traditional leaders to trust the judgment of their teams and empower them to contribute. Lastly, the role-dependent leadership has another problem, which is it doesn't nurture new leaders. So people end up in leadership roles without any prior experience, and we've seen that. It's pretty bad. The second reason is the best teams are those where multiple people show strong leadership skills, as you've seen from my Santa Cruz story. If people only see someone else as a leader, then they're more hesitant to initiating, they're afraid of overstepping, and they might not challenge the strategy. When I say challenging, I don't mean just challenging. I mean challenging because you believe that you take personal accountability to making things happen, and you believe that that's the right thing for the organization. And then lastly, at all the companies that I've worked for, essentially, leadership skills are often a requirement, a must, for growing beyond senior levels. And the career ladder, explicitly requires some sort of leadership skills. It's not just about coding anymore. And not just that, but the expectations of impact are also increased. So this illustrates the career progression, the typical career progression in engineering, where senior is a pivotal point where tracks split between individual contributor and managerial. So beyond senior, leadership skills become more of a requirement. So to summarize this part, we don't need to wait until we're formal leaders with 5+ direct reports to act as leaders. And it's time to embrace and encourage leader-like actions at all levels so that we adopt a model of dynamic shared leadership. And what I mean by this is to have the team's success not hinge on one person's ideas and ability to drive things forward. And that means essentially you might be following me today and I might be following you tomorrow. So we talked about leadership and why it's important for individual contributors. Now let's talk about how do we do that? How do we become a leader? What do we need to do? What are the behaviors? What makes a good IC leader? So I've gathered the 6 big categories of skills that I believe individual contributors should master. And we'll discuss them one by one. We have people skills, driving results, big picture thinking, ownership, leading by example, and influence. The number one people skill that individual contributors should master is communication, which is a broad umbrella. But what I want to say here is that for leaders, what is particularly important when they communicate is to be proactive, to articulate things clearly for different types of people, be patient, and use deliberate redundancy when needed, because sometimes leaders need to repeat themselves in order to make things actually happen, and the ability to communicate with a variety of stakeholders that have different technical backgrounds. And this is important because as an individual contributor, you have access to things that your leadership team might not see, like problems. And it's on you to make a case, if you want to act like a leader, for why that problem should get the resources needed and get fixed, right? The other thing about communication, the final thing, is asking questions. Asking questions is a very powerful leadership tool because it helps you orient the focus where you want it. It helps you understand other people better, and it helps you connect with others, which will help with influence. The second people skill that is a must-have is emotional intelligence. Psychologist Daniel Goleman, who coined the term emotional intelligence, wrote an article for Harvard Business Review called "What Makes a Leader?" And he says, emotional intelligence is the sine qua non of leadership. Without it, a person can have the best training in the world, an incisive analytical mind, and an endless supply of ideas, but he will still not make a great leader. And I love that he highlights exactly what I keep talking about over and over again, that training, ideas, all these hard skills are not going to be enough if you want to become a leader. So some examples of emotional intelligence include self-awareness, so awareness of your own mental state, emotions, strengths, limitations, and so on. The ability to manage your own emotions, the ability to accept change, the ability to describe what you're feeling, and to do this for other people as well. The ability to see and make other people feel seen and heard. The ability to empathize and validate others, and a strong sense of curiosity, especially about other people. The third skill, pretend that's not pixelated, technical errors. The third people skill is feedback, both giving and receiving. And why do I say feedback is an important thing for leaders is because I see it as a tool for course correction. If your goal is to drive results and you see the ship isn't going in the direction you want and you want a way to correct it, you have to give feedback. It helps fix small problems before they become big ones. And it also helps you be better and everyone around you better. It's more of a see something, say something, do something principle. Lastly, the best leaders help develop other people and build others up. What do I mean by this? It means creating opportunities for others to grow. It means mentoring, and it means teaching. Also, building others up is also a critical piece for individual contributors to scale themselves. Think of your impact as what you can achieve through your own work, plus what you can achieve through others. So in this formula, if you want to maximize impact, you have to maximize both of the components. The problem with your individual impact is that it's bounded by time, by how many days, by how many hours are in a day. So in order to maximize impact, therefore, you have to invest in the impact you can have through others. All right, the second category of skills is driving results. And here we have three components. Number one is problem solving. So I already mentioned that the ultimate goal of a leader is to get the job done and drive results. And so when it comes to problem solving, my mental model goes something like this. I see a problem, I think, and I ask myself, why is this problem important? What is the impact? Is this a problem worthwhile solving? And then I ask myself, what can I do about it? Is there anybody else that can solve this problem? What needs to happen in order for this problem to solve? Is it worth building a pitch to ask for the resources and buy-in to make this idea a reality? Then from there, you take the problem, break it into sub-problems, and ask yourself, apply critical thinking. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but figure out what do you know, what do you not know, how can you find out what you not know, what are the trade-offs you need to make, and so on. The second skill here is decision-making. And obviously, it's tied to problem solving, but what I want to emphasize here is the importance of making decisions versus stagnating. So your job as a leader is to avoid analysis paralysis and keep things going, keep momentum, not overanalyze things. Because I've seen teams that just go in circles and they just, don't progress. And your job as a leader is to make everybody move forward. And as I mentioned, oftentimes there's no perfect decision, right? It's a trade-off between multiple imperfect decisions. And you have to take bets and make decisions with incomplete information and treat everything like a big experiment. Lastly, leaders have to drive consensus because you don't have authority necessarily as an individual contributor leader, and your job is to engage the team. So for building consensus, some tips would be listening, involving the team, addressing their concerns, being a mediator, because sometimes people might start butting heads, and you have to facilitate, essentially, decision-making in a group. And lastly, keeping people informed. If you want to make decisions as a team, you want to make sure everybody has access to the same information. And this might sound a little contradicting to the decision-making, but I see leaders need to strike a balance between spending enough time as a group deciding, but also figuring out when they've passed the point of diminishing returns and a decision needs to be made. The third category of leadership skills that are very important is what I call big picture thinking. Leaders are able to have a bird's eye view over the situation, and so they don't get bogged down by the details. They understand how their idea, their project, whatever they're working on, fits into the bigger picture. And if they don't understand, they seek out the information that they need from their higher-ups to understand this. They ask questions. They want to understand what the business ROI is for what they're trying to build. They question why. Why are we building this? They don't just go and build, right? So the scope that they look at is not just short-term. They look long-term. The fourth category of skills is ownership, which means taking accountability for their work. Uber, when I used to work at Uber, they had a core value that illustrated ownership perfectly. The core value said something around the lines of be an owner, not a renter. What does that mean? It means if you own something, you are more incentivized to fix problems early on, right? If there's a leak in the house, you want to fix it as soon as possible before it creates mold and whatnot. If you're a renter, you might be like, I don't really care. I'm going to move out in a year anyway. It doesn't really affect me. But if you're an owner, you go and fix the problem. You have a stake in the game, and you're invested. And so, as an individual contributor, ownership is taking responsibility for getting the project done end to end. Leading by example. This is a very powerful leading technique for both people with leadership titles and without leadership titles. What this means is demonstrating the behaviors and actions you want to see in others. And so in modeling and basically, it's an application of the show, don't tell principle. And so you start acting in the way you want others to emulate. And the beauty of this is that it builds trust and respect, because it's much easier to issue orders from the top and tell people what to do, rather than you being in the trenches and doing the work, right? And so this is also what people find inspiring. And it's the kind of leadership that makes people want to follow. And that's the thing about leadership. You can't really make people follow you. You have to inspire them to follow you. Lastly, influence. You could argue that influence falls under people skills, but I wanted to mention it separately because I think influence depends on people skills, but it's much more than that. So when I say influence, I mean what you need to have an effect is the capacity to have an effect on the development or the character of someone or something. So we usually need influence when we want people to comply, concede, or change with a situation. So those are the 3 C's of influence, without exerting authority, because we don't have authority. If we had authority, if we were in a leadership position, we had authority, we had a different leverage over people. But that's not the kind of leverage we want to be building as an individual contributor leadership. What we want is wholehearted buy-in. We want people to want to do those things. So that is why influence is an absolute core key thing for individual contributor leaders. Influence is often interpreted as persuasion, but that's not what it is. Influence, at the core of it, we have building relationships. We have finding win-win, finding mutually beneficial situations. We have collaboration, collaboratively problem solving, and we have negotiation. So, to summarize, if you master people skills and influence, and always have the big picture in mind, and you act like an owner, and you lead by example, and you drive results with others, you're a leader. That's all I have for today. Thank you very much. Before we jump to questions and answers, this QR code points to my newsletter. And from my newsletter, you can access every other place you can contact me. You can find my LinkedIn, you can find my website, you can find my email, you can find everything if you want to stay in touch. And please do, I would love to connect with all of you and reach out. I'm fairly active on all the platforms. So this is the QR code. Thank you very much.
Let's give Irina another big round of applause, please. She has set the morning for us and set the conference for us. Thank you very much. So now, if you have any questions, please post them on Slido. And we have about 4 or 5 minutes for Irina to answer any questions. Abdu, do we have any questions yet?
How would you deal with the frustration of competing good leaders stepping up and advocating opposing strategies? That is a very interesting question. So when you say advocating opposing strategies, I mean, it's a fair game, right? It's individual contributor leadership. Everybody can come up with whatever strategy they want. The question is, who is able to actually inspire and get the most buy-in? So who is able to actually influence? And the thing about influence, as I mentioned, it's about building relationships. But the thing about building relationships is not about building relationships when you need them. It's about building relationships ahead of time to be able to influence and building what I wrote about, what I call social capital, right? So this is a fair game, in my opinion, right? The question is, who is the most influential at the end of the day? And who can actually get buy-in. I do want to say that I think it is the manager's job to sort of be the leader in this case, and if People keep arguing. Like, they need to set a timeline to, okay, we need to make a decision. We're going with this strategy or this other, not going in circles. All right, introverted coder, thank you for being here. People skills come more naturally to some people than others. Can everyone learn these skills? The answer is absolutely yes. There are, soft skills come with practice, obviously. Just like you learn programming, you were not born knowing programming. It probably took you years of exercise and repetition and failures. And it's the absolute same with people skills. You're right. It comes more naturally to some people. And it's the same with programming, right? It does come more naturally to some people. There's no difference. But, for example, things like listening. There are exercises and techniques you can learn to be a better listener, to really understand others and empathize. So the answer is yes. And if you want to learn more, please come find me and I will point you in the right direction. How do you drive accountability in a team? Great question. I think accountability is one of those things that needs to be part of the culture. And I think in a psychological safe culture, which, again, psychological safety is not necessarily something that is owned by one individual, it needs to kind of happen. But accountability is the ability to look at mistakes and learn from them without necessarily attaching ourselves to it. So things like postmortems or incident reviews, whatever moments we have to learn from mistakes is how we create accountability. And again, accountability doesn't mean punishment in a psychological safe place. But the point of accountability is to learn and make amends and be better and learn, essentially. So if you are an individual contributor leader and your team, you see these opportunities to create these meetings where you review mistakes and you have an open discussion about it, I would suggest you go for that. How multiple IC leaders could exist inside one team? Is it even possible? The answer is yes. I've worked on teams that had, essentially, there were multiple tech leads owning various things. And the tech lead that was leading something, then the next project they weren't. They just did IC work. So it is possible as long as ownership is sort of defined. If you are a formal tech lead, if it's more like you take leadership around a specific discussion or a specific aspect or a specific decision you want to make, that's sort of separate, but you can coexist. I think what's important is for people to understand that there's room for everybody, and the fact that I also step up and I have a different opinion, I'm not attacking you, the other leader, I'm just challenging you for the better, the collective better of everybody. I'm trying to go through as many questions as possible, but all of these deserve like a more at-length answer. So if this wasn't enough, please find me, and I'm more than happy to continue discussing with you. I've naturally grown to a leader position, and it doesn't bring me as much joy as an IC. It is possible to learn to enjoy leading, or it's just not for everyone. Great question, very honest question. I think it's okay to not be for everyone. Leading is stressful. It is a lot of pressure. If you don't want to do it, don't do it, rather than trying to do it and not being happy about it, right? I think it is important for someone to do this. Someone needs to do it, right? What they say. But if you don't particularly feel drawn to it and you would rather, go deep on a technical problem or whatever, just do that. Not everybody has to do this, and it's okay. What is your POV on the latest hot leadership trend, servant leadership? First of all, this is not the latest hot leadership trend. This has been around for decades. My POV on, in general, buzzwords is that I don't like them. So there's servant leadership, but there's also transformational leadership. That's also like a different thing, right? I try to stay away, and I know people love frameworks and they love acronyms and they love, buzzwords. But what I advise people is to think, what do they care about, right? And as a leader, you have to care about others. Whether you call yourself a servant leader or a transformational leader or whatever, are you doing the behaviors that we talked about, right? I think that's what it comes down to. And servant leadership specifically has the building of others and the involving others. But what I think servant leadership as a definition doesn't, and that's just my personal style, for the record, what I think it doesn't emphasize enough is leaders need to be decisive. So sure, I will listen to everybody, I will involve everybody, but I will also keep the time check and say, you know, we need to move forward with the decision here. Like, yes, democracy is democracy, but then we have to make progress. So that's just my personal style. What if influence, the last question. What if influence is broken by the other leaders, by not cooperating? If you reach your limits of communication without authority? Yeah, it's interesting. I've worked with difficult people, and they were not cooperating, and it took me time to crack them, but I did. Again, people skills. I had to have conversation with these people, not about the topic that we were fighting about. I had to really understand where they were coming from, because usually when people are super stubborn, they're either trying to be very efficient, they're like, why are you wasting my time with this? You know, but having a one-on-one with them and trying to understand and showing empathy, that I see that they're trying to be efficient, I see what they're going for, it made them soften up. So it's about winning people over, and that's also possible. Okay, well, I guess that was it. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I know it's hot, so please take some air.
Thank you, Irina. Thank you very much.